The first sign was the stars going out. Not all of them. Just a patch, a dark section in the southern sky above the Indian Ocean where, one by one, the stars stopped being visible. Astronomers noticed it at 3:14 in the morning. By 3:22, military satellites had already classified what was blocking them. 9,700 ships. They came in silence, no radio signal, no warning broadcast, no light. Just mass, an enormous wall of metal dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a perfectly coordinated arc around the planet. When the sun rose that morning, people in the northern hemisphere stepped outside and saw the sky was wrong. There were shapes in it that had no business being there. Dark geometric forms catching the early light, hanging motionless above the clouds. The Verk Dominion had arrived. Their surrender broadcast came 40 minutes later. It played on every frequency in 47 languages, translated perfectly. The voice was flat and mechanical and very certain of itself. It listed the 43 civilizations the Dominion had already absorbed. It described the terms: full military stand-down, transfer of planetary governance, and peaceful integration into the Dominion within 6 hours. Resistance, the voice explained, would result in orbital bombardment. Then it repeated the message in 47 languages again, just in case anyone had missed it. On board the USDC command vessel Resolute, Admiral Rowe listened to the broadcast twice. He was a compact man with a shaved head and the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for slowness. He had spent 11 years commanding submarines before moving to Space Command, and he still thought like a submarine captain: slow breath, quiet room, absolute patience. He set down the printed transcript of the broadcast and looked at the tactical display. "Director Osai's grid is live?" he asked. His communications officer confirmed it was. "Lunar batteries charged." "Confirmed." "Swarm clusters in the belt, autonomous mode still running." "Confirmed." Rowe nodded. "Then we wait for the 6 hours to pass." Nobody in the room said anything. They had all been here for 3 weeks, since Director Osai's intelligence team had decoded the Verk approach vector and worked backward from drive signatures to arrival time. 3 weeks was not a long time, but humanity had used every hour of it. The mines came first. 40,000 gravity well mines placed in tight clusters along every viable orbital insertion path around Earth. Not visible, not broadcasting, just sitting in the dark, waiting for something large and metal to get close. The Verk fleet had parked itself directly on top of several thousand of them. Director Osai had calculated this deliberately. She was a small woman who wore plain clothes and rarely raised her voice, and she had correctly predicted the Verk arrival window, their preferred orbital formation, and their standard 6-hour surrender demand based on behavioral patterns from their previous 43 conquests. She had placed the mines where the fleet would be, not where it had been. The 6 hours passed. No human authority surrendered anything. Grand Commander Ushek, aboard the Verk flagship, waited an additional 11 minutes standard protocol, and then authorized the first bombardment wave. His fleet had absorbed 43 worlds. This was a formality. He pressed the command. The mines detonated. Not all of them. Proximity triggers were staggered to avoid chain reaction interference, but enough. The detonations ran through the Verk formation like a wave through water. Ships that had been sitting still one moment were suddenly tumbling, venting atmosphere, or simply gone. The explosions were quiet from the ground. People watching from coastlines saw distant flashes in the upper atmosphere, like lightning in a clear sky. In 4 minutes and 19 seconds, 340 Verk warships were destroyed. Ushek stood at his tactical display and said nothing. His second, Sub-Commander Yale, stood beside him and also said nothing. The numbers were wrong. The numbers were completely wrong. Pre-invasion intelligence had classified Earth as a pre-war civilization with no space-based weapons and no unified defense command. The report had been thorough. It had been checked. It had also been 3 years old. Reevaluate threat classification, Ushek said finally. Yale was already doing it. He pulled the sensor data from the mine detonations, tried to map the spread, tried to understand the placement geometry. Whoever had placed these had known exactly where the fleet would be. That was not luck. That was not a pre-war civilization guessing. Someone had studied them. On the Resolute, Rowe watched the casualty numbers from the Verk fleet appear on his screen. 340 ships. His expression did not change. "Rail batteries on standby," he said. "Volkov's wing fueled and ready." His officer confirmed. Lieutenant Daria Volkov and 80 fighter interceptors were sitting in launch bays, engines cold, waiting for the order. "Not yet," Rowe said. "Let them reorganize first. Let them think they understand what just happened." He turned back to the display. The Verk fleet was already reshuffling, pulling back from the mine zones, reforming into a tighter, more aggressive configuration. They were angry now. Ushek was moving to his standard three-wave battle doctrine, the same one he had used 43 times before. Rowe had read about that doctrine. Director Osai had translated it from captured records 2 weeks ago and left a summary on his desk with a short note attached. The note said, "They always do this next. Be ready." He was ready. Outside, in the dark above the clouds, 9,360 Verk ships prepared their next move. They had no way of knowing that the woman who had placed the mines had also read their playbook, that the admiral waiting for them thought in silences and angles, that the planet below them had spent 2,000 years learning, the hard way, exactly how to make an enemy regret arriving. Ushek gave the order for Wave 1. Rowe said, "Now." The Verk had a name for their first battle wave. Translated literally, it meant the silencing. It was designed to destroy orbital weapons platforms, burn out communication arrays, and leave the target world deaf and blind before the second wave moved in. It had worked 43 times. The silencing began with a coordinated mass fire from 400 Verk vessels targeting Earth's known orbital stations. The energy beams were precise, powerful, and fired in overlapping patterns that left no gaps. In a normal engagement, nothing in orbit would have survived the first 30 seconds. The platforms did not survive. What replaced them was the problem. Each destroyed station triggered a signal, automated, pre-programmed, that activated 3 backup systems buried in hardened casings in Earth's upper atmosphere. These were not stations. They were not large. They were compact, armored, and disposable, designed to do one thing: transmit targeting data to the batteries on the far side of the moon. The batteries had been there for 11 days. Railguns, 12 of them, anchored to the lunar surface on the dark side where no Verk sensor pass had thought to look. They fired electromagnetically, no exhaust, no energy signature, no warning. The slugs traveled at 8 kilometers per second and arrived without any of the light signals the Verk used to track incoming fire. The first salvo hit before Ushek's tactical team even registered the launch. 14 Verk warships were gone before anyone on the bridge understood what had killed them. The second salvo was already in transit. The third was being loaded. Sub-Commander Yale watched the impacts on his screen and felt something he did not have a precise word for in the Verk language. The closest translation was, "The ground is not where I thought it was." "Weapons origin," Ushek demanded. "Lunar surface," Yale said. "Dark side, we have no coverage there." Ushek absorbed this, moved the outer wing to lunar suppression. 200 ships broke from formation and accelerated toward the moon. They were good ships. Their crews were trained. They would find the batteries and destroy them. They did not know the batteries were already being moved. The railgun platform sat on automated crawlers, slow, but slow was fine when the enemy had a predictable response time. By the time the Verk wing reached the lunar surface, the guns were already 4 kilometers from their last firing position, and new targeting data from Earth's surviving atmospheric sensors was feeding them updated coordinates. The Verk wing spent 40 minutes searching. The guns fired twice more during that time. While this was happening in space, Lieutenant Daria Volkov was already moving. She led 80 fighter interceptors out of their launch bays in a staggered formation, not toward the Verk line, which would have been suicide, but through it. Specifically through the gap between Wave 1's left flank and the Verk reserve cluster, sitting 800 kilometers further out. The gap was 40 kilometers wide. Volkov had measured it from sensor data and decided 40 kilometers was enough. Her wing flew dark, no active sensors, no radio communication, everything turned off except manual controls and a shared target list loaded before launch. The Verk, accustomed to fighting enemies who needed their electronics to function, almost missed them entirely. Almost. 3 interceptors were destroyed on the approach. The other 77 reached the reserve cluster and split into pre-assigned pairs. Each pair had 2 objectives: plant a localized EMP charge on the hull of the nearest large Verk vessel and get out before the 7-minute detonation timer ran down. Planting a charge on the hull of an enemy warship at combat speed was not a gentle process. 4 more interceptors were lost to collision damage, 2 more to Verk point defense that woke up too late but still fast enough. One pilot miscalculated her exit vector and flew into her own ship's engine exhaust. She survived barely and limped home on attitude thrusters alone. 61 of 80 returned. The EMP charges detonated in sequence across a 12-minute window. Each one took out the electronics of the host vessel and, depending on proximity, several neighboring ships. 200 Verk warships went dark. Not destroyed, dark. Drifting. Their crews alive but unable to control anything, unable to communicate, unable to do anything except watch through portholes while the battle continued around them. Ushek was now managing 3 simultaneous problems. Lunar batteries he could not locate, 200 dead ships cluttering his formation, and a casualty count that had passed 600 and was still moving. He made a decision. He opened a command channel to his ground force carriers. Yale looked at him. "You want to land troops now. We don't have air superiority." "We have never needed air superiority for a landing," Ushek said. 43 worlds. "This is the 44th, Yale said. Ushek sent the order anyway. What neither of them knew, what no one in the Verk fleet knew, was that Director Osai's intelligence team had cracked their communication encryption 48 hours ago. Every order Ushek gave was being read in a basement in Geneva 12 minutes before it was executed. Rowe had the Verk's next move in his hands before the Verk made it. He read the order for ground landings and passed it to Sergeant Bram Harlow. Harlow was a large, quiet man from rural Australia who had spent 12 years in orbital drop infantry. He read the message, looked at his platoon, and said 4 words. "They are coming down." His soldiers checked their equipment without being told. Outside, 800 Verk troop carriers broke from the fleet and began descent. 2 million soldiers. Every landing zone they had ever taken had fallen within hours. They had never landed on a planet preparing for them for 3 weeks. Harlow pulled on his helmet. The Verk did not understand roads. Not the concept, they understood roads. What they did not understand was that roads could be a weapon, that a civilization which had spent centuries fighting itself had learned to treat its own infrastructure as a tool of war. When the first Verk troop carriers touched down in the flatlands of northern Europe, their forward scouts moved out according to standard doctrine: secure the roads, advance on the nearest population center, establish a visible military presence that would break civilian morale. It had worked on every world they had taken. The sight of armored columns moving through streets was usually enough to end organized resistance within hours. The roads had been flooded. Not just in Europe. In every landing zone, 12 sites across 4 continents. The surrounding road networks had been destroyed, flooded, cratered, or blocked with vehicles and rubble in the 72 hours before landing. The Werk columns that rolled out of their carriers found themselves moving through mud, detour after detour, their armored vehicles burning fuel at 3 times the planned rate. This was not an accident. Director Osai's ground coordination team had worked from satellite imagery and pre-assigned every engineering unit in the surrounding regions a specific list of roads, bridges, and valleys to destroy or flood. Nobody had announced it. Nobody had released a statement about it. It had simply been done, quietly and completely, before the first Werk soldier set foot on soil. Sergeant Harlow's drop platoon hit the ground near a Werk forward base that had been established in the first 6 hours of landing, a logistics relay point in a flat agricultural region, chosen by the Werk because it had clear lines of sight and easy access to their supply drop zones. What the Werk did not know was that the supply drop zone coordinates had been altered. 40 hours into the ground war, Harlow's unit had captured a Werk communications relay intact. One of his soldiers, a young woman named Petra who had 2 years of technical training and no particular fear of anything, had spent 4 hours pulling the relay's transmission protocols apart until she understood them well enough to feed false data into them. She changed the GPS coordinates of every Werk supply drop in the region by 11 kilometers. The supplies kept coming. Automated cargo pods, launched from the orbiting troop carriers, followed their programmed coordinates exactly and landed in a river valley 11 kilometers west of every Werk ground position. 2 million soldiers on the ground found themselves receiving nothing. No ammunition resupply. No food. No medical equipment. Harlow watched a Werk patrol come within 200 meters of their position and stop. The soldiers looked lost. They were checking their communication equipment, which was working fine, but the answers coming back were wrong. Harlow told his unit to hold position. He watched the patrol turn around and walk back the way it had come. "They're starting to feel it," Petra said quietly. This was not the only problem the Werk were facing on the ground. The civilian population, rather than retreating into shelters as the Werk doctrine predicted, had organized. Not into armies, into networks. Factories had been emptied and their contents moved underground before landing. Food stores had been relocated. Water systems had backup routing that the Werk could not easily map. When Werk units moved into towns, they found empty buildings, disabled utilities, and no one to threaten. The strategy of occupying population centers and using civilians to compel military surrender simply could not function when there were no civilians in the centers. In one town in South America, the Werk garrison found the buildings were filled with noise-making devices on timers, not weapons, just metal and speakers creating constant sound at irregular intervals. It served no military purpose. It just made the Werk soldiers inside the town miserable and unable to sleep. Subcommander Yale read the ground reports from orbit and began his personal log that night. He was not supposed to keep one. Werk military regulations did not encourage personal documentation during campaigns. He kept it anyway. He wrote, "They fight the ground itself. They remove roads, food, silence, certainty. Our soldiers win every direct engagement and still fall backwards." By the end of 72 hours, the 2 million Werk ground forces had seized 0 strategic objectives. They controlled land, open fields, empty roads, vacant buildings, but none of the things that made land useful. No fuel depots, no communication infrastructure, no food, no captive population, just mud and silence and a supply chain that kept delivering to the wrong valley. Ashek ordered the recall. It was not framed as a retreat. It was framed as a tactical consolidation, the kind of language that military commanders use when they need the truth to arrive slowly. But the troop carriers descending from orbit to recover the ground forces had to fight their way through renewed atmospheric fire, and 60 of them did not make it back. Harlow watched the carriers ascending from a hillside, rain coming down hard, boots soaked through. One of his soldiers asked if they had won. Harlow thought about the question. 41,000 human dead, last count. Empty towns, ruined roads, a river valley full of Verk supply pods going to waste. 2 million enemy soldiers retreating from a ground they had never managed to hold. "We made it expensive," he said. That was the most honest answer he had. Above the clouds, the Verk fleet regrouped around what remained of itself. Ushek's casualty count had now passed 1,200 ships. He had come with 9,700. He still had more than enough to try something else. He was going to try something else. What he chose next would cost him nearly everything. The Verk had a saying, old enough that no one remembered who first said it. Numbers are the argument that ends all arguments. Ushek believed this. He had believed it through 43 campaigns, through every world that looked defensible until his fleet arrived, through every species that thought its weapons or its terrain or its cleverness would be enough. Numbers had always been the answer. When in doubt, commit everything to one overwhelming push and let mass settle the question. He still had over 8,000 ships. His plan was simple. Pull the entire remaining fleet into a single concentrated formation and drive it straight at Earth, not in waves, not with flanking movements, just a wall of 8,000 warships moving together at full power. The defense grid could not destroy 8,000 ships before some of them reached the planet. Once ships reached firing range, it was over. He told Yale. Yale said nothing for a moment then. What about the asteroid belt corridor? The most direct inward path from the Verk's current position passed through the outer fringe of the asteroid belt. Not the dense inner belt, just the loose outer edge, manageable rock density, nothing that should cause problems for a fleet in formation. Ushek considered it. We navigated at low speed. Rocks are not a threat. The rocks are not what I am thinking about, Yale said. He did not explain further because he could not. It was just a feeling, an instinct built from reading the pattern of this entire engagement, the mines that were already in position, the guns that moved before they could be found, the supply coordinates that fed them the wrong location. Every time the Verk had moved, something had already been placed in their path before they decided to move there. Something had probably been placed in the asteroid belt before they decided to go through it. Ushek gave the order anyway. 3 weeks earlier, in a planning room in Geneva, Director Osa had stood in front of a star map and pointed at the asteroid belt fringe with a pen. "This is where they will try to push through if they decide to commit everything," she had said. "It is the most direct path and they are a direct species. They conquer in straight lines." She had authorized the deployment of 40 million microdrones into the belt fringe. Each drone was small, about the size of a human fist, built from cheap materials, carrying a simple processor and a contact explosive. Individually, a single drone was almost nothing. It could dent hull plating at best. The drones were not designed to operate individually. They were programmed to form swarms, emergent clusters based on proximity, target density, and a simple behavioral rule. Attach to the largest nearby object and signal your neighbors. When enough neighbors gathered on the same target, detonate together. It was not a sophisticated weapons system. It was modeled loosely on how certain insects on Earth defended their colonies. Not smart, just relentless. The Verk fleet entered the belt fringe at reduced speed, navigating carefully around the larger rocks. Nobody noticed the drones. They were too small to register on standard sensors and they were not broadcasting anything. They were just floating, inert, waiting. The first cluster activated when a Verk cruiser passed within 40 meters of a drift cloud of about 6,000 drones. The drones did not attack immediately. They followed the ship. They gathered on the hull slowly over 20 minutes, attaching to seams and intake vents and sensor housings. The ship's crew noticed the sensor static first, then the hull sounds a faint, irregular ticking, like something outside knocking. Then 6,000 drones detonated simultaneously at 17 different points along the hull. The cruiser did not explode. It just stopped working. Every seal along the detonation lines failed. Atmosphere vented. The engines, which had been ingesting drones through their intakes for 20 minutes, shredded themselves from the inside. The ship went dark and began to drift. Then the neighboring ships started finding their own clouds. The Verk tried to respond. They fired weapons at the swarms, and some weapons worked, burning patches of drones away. But for every cleared patch, 3 more clouds were already moving toward the ship from other directions. The drones had no fear response, no survival instinct, no need to communicate with a command structure that could be jammed. They just moved toward metal and gathered on it. Over the next 4 hours, 1,400 Verk warships went dark. Not all at once. Gradually, ship by ship, cruiser by cruiser, the fleet's formation developed holes. Crews that were not under direct attack watched their neighbors go silent and did not know when their own cloud would arrive. The uncertainty was its own kind of damage. Lieutenant Volkov watched from a holding position outside the belt, her wing grounded and unneeded. She had expected to feel something, satisfaction, maybe, or the specific tired relief of a fight ending. Instead, she felt something quieter and harder to name. Those ships going dark had crews in them, soldiers following orders from a commander who had never expected this. She thought about the Verk troops she had seen on sensor feeds during the ground operation, the patrol that got lost, the supply carriers with nowhere to go. She wondered if any of them had wanted to come here. The thought did not make her lower her guard. It just sat in the back of her mind and made the silence after each new dark ship feel heavier. Yale's log that night. I was right about the belt. I said nothing useful. I wrote it here instead. The surviving Verk fleet, fewer than 600 ships, broke formation. Ushek did not order the retreat. He simply stopped being able to stop it. There was a moment, somewhere in the 4th hour of the Verk retreat, when Rowe could have given a single order and ended everything. He did not give it. His weapons officers were watching the fleeing fleet on their screens, scattered ships pulling away in every direction, no formation, no coordination, just a mass of survivors trying to get to a distance where they felt safe. The railgun batteries on the moon were ready. The remaining drone clusters were still active in the belt. Volkov's wing was fueled and armed. There were things in orbit that had not yet been used at all. Defense layers that the Verk fleet had never reached because it had been stopped before it got close enough to trigger them. From a purely technical standpoint, 600 ships running in open space were easier to destroy than 9,700 ships in formation. Rowe stood at his display for a long time. Then he opened a direct communication channel to the Verk flagship. It took 11 minutes for anyone to respond. When the response came, it was not Ushek. It was Yale. His voice sounded like someone who had not slept in 3 days and had stopped being surprised by anything. Rowe said, "I want to speak with your commander." Another pause, then Ushek's voice flat and careful, "I am here." Rowe did not congratulate himself. He did not give a speech. He spoke the way he always spoke, plainly, with the same tone he used to give coordinates to a helmsman. "You have roughly 580 ships still functioning," he said. "I want you to understand something before you decide what to do next. The mines, the rail batteries, the swarms, the interceptor operations, all of that was Phase 1 and Phase 2 of our defensive doctrine. We are currently in Phase 3. I have 4 additional phases that have not been activated." He then listed them, not in vague terms, in specific terms of weapons systems, deployment ranges, estimated effectiveness against fleet-class vessels. He gave Ushek the numbers. "Silence. I'm not telling you this to frighten you," Rowe continued. I am telling you because I want you to make an informed decision. There is a withdrawal corridor on the sunward side of the system, bearing 227 by 14. Any ship that enters that corridor and maintains course will not be engaged. Ships that do not enter the corridor or that turn back toward Earth will be destroyed. You have 40 minutes to decide. Ushek said nothing for a long time. Then, why are you allowing any of us to leave? Rowe considered how much to say. He decided on the truth. Because dead ships don't carry information, he said. I need you to go home. The channel went quiet. Yale wrote in his log, "The human admiral offered us a corridor. He explained exactly how he could have destroyed us all and chose not to. I do not know if this is mercy or strategy. I think it may be both at the same time. I am not sure we have a word for that." Not all of the retreating ships received the broadcast. Some were too damaged, some were out of communication range, some had commanders who were past the point of processing new information and were simply running. Earth's defense systems destroyed those ships, not out of anger, not with any ceremony. The targeting computers flagged them as continuing threats and engaged them. It was not personal. It was not personal. On the bridge of the Resolute, a weapons officer looked up from his screen. "Sir, we have ships still on intercept vectors. Recommend engagement." "Engage," Rowe said. His voice did not change. More ships went dark. Then slowly, the surviving vessels turned. One by one, in groups of 2 and 3, the remaining Verk ships adjusted course toward bearing 227 by 14. They moved into the corridor like animals walking through a gate they did not fully trust, waiting for something to close behind them. Nothing closed. The corridor held. Earth systems tracked every ship that entered it, logged their signatures, confirmed their trajectories, and let them pass. 18 ships crossed the outer boundary of the solar system and entered open space. Rowe watched the last one disappear from his screen. Behind him, someone in the operations room started clapping, then someone else. Within a few seconds, the whole room was on its feet. Rowe did not join them. He was looking at a different screen, the one showing the final casualty numbers from across the entire engagement. He had been updating it in his head throughout the battle, but now it was finalized and confirmed, and seeing it as a single printed number on a screen was different from carrying it as an estimate. 41,000 dead. Not soldiers, people. People with families, with morning routines, with things they had been meaning to do after the war. 41,000 of them, across the orbital platforms, the interceptor wings, the ground units, the civilians who had been in the wrong place when a landing zone was established. He stood there until the room quieted down on its own. Then he sat at his desk and began writing letters. He wrote one for each of the 41,000. That was not realistic, and he knew it. He wrote the first one and then stopped. He sat for a while, then he wrote the second one. Outside the window of his office, Earth turned slowly in the light of its sun. No ships in the sky anymore. Just clouds and blue water and the faint edge of a coastline, brown and green, unchanged. Director Osai sent him a message. Phase 4 is ready when you are. He did not reply immediately. He kept writing letters. The Verk capital station was called the Eternal Seat, which had felt like an appropriate name for most of its 800-year history. When the 18 surviving ships docked, one by one, over the course of a long and silent afternoon, the name felt less appropriate. 18 ships, 9,700 had left. The docking bay was full of Verk officials, military staff, and High Council observers. They had received the numbers by transmission days ago, but seeing the ships battered, scarred, some with visible hull damage still unrepaired, made the numbers feel different, real in a way that a transmission could not fully carry. Grand Commander Ushek was the first to disembark. He looked older than when he had left. Not physically, it had only been weeks, but there was something in the way he walked, something that had been removed from him, a particular confidence that the Verk military spent years instilling in its commanders, and that usually lasted their entire careers. It was gone. The High Council summoned him immediately. He spoke for almost 3 hours. He described the mines that were already in position before the fleet arrived. He described the guns on the dark side of the moon that fired without any visible energy signature. He described the cracked encryption, that one landed hard, because it meant every order he had given had been known to the enemy before his own captains acted on it. He described the ground war that ate 2 million soldiers without surrendering a single city or food supply. He described the swarm, 40 million small machines that had no fear and no signal to jam, and no central system to destroy. And then he described the last thing, the corridor. The human admiral who had opened a channel, listed every remaining weapon at his disposal, and offered a route home, not out of weakness, not out of mercy in any simple sense, out of deliberate, calculated decision to send survivors back as messengers. When he finished, the chamber was quiet. One council member, old, decorated, the kind who had approved the invasion with complete confidence, leaned forward and asked, "Why did they not destroy all of you?" Ashek answered, "Because they wanted you to hear this." Another silence, longer. Sub-Commander Yale's personal log was confiscated upon return, standard procedure for combat personnel. It was reviewed, flagged as sensitive, classified, and filed in a restricted archive. This was the correct procedure. It prevented the contents from spreading. It did not prevent the contents from spreading. A junior archivist copied it. The copy moved through Verk space slowly at first, then faster. A translation appeared in the language of the Drell, one of the 43 absorbed species, within 2 years. From the Drell it moved to the Ven, then to the Harathi, then across 9 other species in 11 years. Yale had not written it as a warning or a rallying document. He had written it as an honest account, because he was the kind of person who needed to put things in order when they were confusing. That honesty was exactly why it spread. The passage that appeared most often in translations and discussions across 17 worlds came from his final entry, written the night the 18 ships cleared Earth's solar system. It read, "Do not go to Earth, not because you cannot match their weapons. They will build new ones, not because you cannot break their formations. They will form new ones. Go because of what you will find in between the weapons and the formations. Go because they have made an entire science out of making enemies pay for arriving. Go because their admiral let us leave not out of kindness, but because our survival was more useful to him than our deaths. A species that calculates mercy is more dangerous than one that simply fights." He had then added a single final line, separated from the rest, which most translators left alone because it did not need context. "I think they have been waiting for someone to come." On Earth, months after the engagement ended, Daria Volkov was sitting on a hillside outside a small town in central Norway when her communicator buzzed. It was Harlow. She had not spoken to him since the ground war. They talked for a while about nothing in particular. The weather where he was, a meal he had eaten that he liked, a noise his car was making that he could not identify. She told him about the hillside, the early spring grass, the way the light was coming through the clouds at a low angle and making everything look like it was made of something other than what it was actually made of. He asked, "Do you think they will come back?" She thought about it. Thought about Ushek's voice on the communication channel that Rowe had shared with senior staff. Thought about the 18 ships moving through the corridor, slow and careful, not trusting the space around them. Thought about 41,000 names on a list that someone was writing letters for. "Probably," she said, "something always comes back. What do we do?" She looked at the light on the grass. "Director Osai is already on phase 4, she said. Harlow was quiet for a moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close to one. The sound of someone who finds a specific kind of comfort in specific kinds of answers. They talked a little longer, then said goodbye. The hillside was quiet after that. The clouds moved, the light changed. Somewhere in a building in Geneva, a woman with a plain jacket and a pen was drawing lines on a star map, measuring distances, writing numbers in the margins. She had already started on phase 5.